So thanks everyone for joining, and thanks panelists for being here. We'll jump into a quick round of introductions in a second, but I guess the theme is building a GenAI startup, but we thought we'd go a little bit more in depth and focus a bit on agents, as it's obviously a very relevant topic and something where there's some new ideas that have been coming out pretty recently. But maybe just to kick off, I think intros from people themselves is normally better than me trying to do a bad job of it. So Dan, do you want to give a quick intro to you and your company?
Yeah, sure. I'm Dan. Nice to meet everybody. So our company, Unify, is basically working on dynamic routing between LLMs. So you can imagine that GPT-4 is very good, but it's also very expensive. For the easier prompts, you don't need to be sending it to this big expensive model. So we can basically ahead of time know which are the easy prompts, send those to smaller, cheaper models. And then what you end up with is something that's pretty much as good as GPT-4, but like a fraction of the cost. This is kind of in a nutshell what we're doing.
It's a good idea.
And Merym?
I'm Merym, co-founder and CEO of TitanML. We help enterprises deploy GenAI apps securely and within their own environment. So if you're self-hosting an LLM, it's pretty cumbersome. It's a lot of infrastructure you need to build. We provide all that infrastructure.
Amazing. And Danilo?
Yeah, I work in the developer experience team in AWS, and I help customers be successful with what we build. And I recently spent a lot of time with Generative AI, both to help developers use GenAI in their daily work and also inside their applications.
Amazing. And well, let's start with you, Danilo. I'll put you on the spot.
Okay.
I said we wanted to jump into agents, and just Danilo joined this panel about 5 minutes ago as a replacement, so I'm being a bit mean. But agents in the generative AI space, for those who aren't so familiar, how would you summarize what they are and why they're so relevant right now?
The idea of an agent is to replicate something similar to what we do when we have to solve a complex problem. You know, we don't solve a complex problem in one shot. We get the input and create magically the output, but we decompose a problem into tasks. Each task can be something that we can reason about, something that implies an action. Maybe the action is to collect some more data or to change something in a system. So it's a sort of workflow that takes a complex problem, decompose it into smaller tasks, and then each task can be something that the agent can handle directly or with the help of some more traditional application to connect to a data source or to call an API, for example.
Amazing. Anything you want to jump in on that?
I could just add that I think it's kind of got interesting analogies to kind of almost like Monte Carlo rollout of like, if you think about AlphaGo and things like this, like when it beat the Go champion, that involved going to lots of different states that weren't the current state and like predicting ahead of time what the best decision to do there would be. And I guess I find it interesting with agents that you kind of like have this base set of knowledge, and it's just kind of like tweaking the parameters and tweaking the way that things are phrased and kind of extracting this latent knowledge out that you can't necessarily get from one prompt. So it's kind of almost just like, yeah, as I mean, it reminds me a little bit of Monte Carlo rollout in planning in a way to kind of get it in as many different states and extract the best you can. Just something I thought I'd say.
No, it sounded very smart, and I agree. I guess that non-determinism that comes with a Monte Carlo-based approach, or like, agents can go super deep and the chain of thought can be quite long. I guess in an enterprise scenario, which I guess you work in mostly, Merym, like how are they dealing with that level of non-determinism in agent workflows?
I think on the whole, enterprises are not using agentic workflows precisely for the reason that you outlined. They have potential to go a little bit off the rails because their task is not super well defined of like, this particular model does X thing and I expect the output to look like this. They're very difficult to predict, and they're also very difficult to govern. And given the current state of enterprise GenAI adoption, which is pretty early on, they're not really used there. Where we see people actually using agents nowadays is like in the startup ecosystem, where you have a lot more freedom to try things and get things wrong, and you're not under the same kind of risk and reputational damage and risk as well. So for enterprises, what we're seeing is that they're kind of holding back a little bit. They're definitely interested, especially for use cases like analytics. We see a lot of interest in agents, but nothing actually getting built. Yeah.
That makes sense. And not to put you on the spot, Danilo, to ask you about which model is the best. But Dan, well, Merym, go ahead.
I was like, if you asked me yesterday, I'd give a different answer to today. Like, it's just impossible to say.
But then I guess, Dan, your startup is really specialized in the routing between different models, right?
Yeah.
So when it comes to agent-based workflows, do you see some models being favored over others? Are all models applicable?
I think one of the really good things with agents is that you can actually get very good performance with cheaper models. So in terms of like agent coder and doing things that are kind of like Devin style with like software engineering, there's actually, when you apply certain agent workflows, you get very similar performance between GPT 3.5 and GPT 4, for example, using the same approach. So I think I kind of think the cheaper models have a lot more to gain with agent workflows, and therefore you can end up having something that maybe queries Gemma 7b 60 times, and is still way cheaper than GPT-4 and is much better at the task. So I think that's kind of how I think about it. I think the low-hanging fruit is agent workflows on cheaper models that can then rival these kind of very expensive one-shot systems. Yeah, and I think Gemma's pretty good. Gemma's pretty good. Mixtool's obviously very good. These are probably the two open source ones that I use mainly. Yeah.
And Merym, in an enterprise setting, are you seeing the flexibility of using different models, open source and not open source, as being options?
I think the key thing that we're seeing in enterprise is not that people are picking a model and saying this is the best, but people are building their architectures in a model agnostic way. Like, it is so important that you're not building your architecture against one particular model or one particular type of model. Because, for example, there are now non-transformer based models, which are also very, very, very good, which in 6 months' time might be the new paradigm. So we need to be sure that, whichever model we pick, we're building it in a way where it's interoperable between different models, and we can swap models in and out, which I guess is like you're providing that kind of unified API layer for us with open source models. It's very easy to kind of take, for example, Gemma out and put Mistral in, for example. And I think that's the overriding thing I'm seeing, rather than, one model is favored. However, I do know this for certain. The most popular model in enterprise use today, does anyone want to guess which one it is? Most popular model? What? Llama?
GPT.
No.
Mistral. Falcon 7B.
No, think more proprietary.
Amazon Tyson.
You stole my name, but no. It's actually OpenAI, and specifically the Azure OpenAI. So that's like by far the most popular thing that we're seeing in production at the moment.
Makes sense. I guess, Danilo, to put you on the spot for something you said at a pub 3 months ago, but we were talking about moving between different models. And I think we had a bit of not an argument, but a debate about the focus on prompt engineering versus fine-tuning, and your view that if people are going to move between different models, a focus on fine-tuning might be a better way to sort of gather your assets in terms of data, rather than focusing too much on prompt engineering.
Yes.
Did I
That's
summarize your
something
point fairly?
that I'm still researching right now to get more data. And fine-tuning then works very well with cheap and small models for specific tasks, of course. And these cheap models are also faster. That with agents that have multiple invocation, it's an additional benefit. But more generally, my fear is that when I see these very long prompts, I see this as technical debt, because when we have to update the model or for any reason switch the model, some parts don't work. I had issues myself with an internal application where basically I was producing a JSON output with a list, and at some point I updated to a newer Claude model and it broke. And the reason why that inside this very long prompt that was composed by multiple prompts, there was an example of a list with items. And this example was breaking the JSON syntax because the new model was smarter. So it was speaking more from the context than the previous version. So sometimes it's difficult to handle this kind of things. So personally, I think fine-tuning is something that should be stressed more, and I see a lot of opportunities for startups to simplify fine-tuning, creating the data for fine-tuning in the right format for customers starting from unstructured data, for example, is something that I see a lot of opportunities. And also as a company, fine-tuning allows you to create a data bank of data. So you basically create, to do fine-tuning, you have a list of examples, like if I want this, if I give you this is the output that I want. So this is something that is very portable. It's something that can grow over time. It becomes your intellectual property as a company. And then if you want to switch model, you can just refine-tune with this data set. So I see something that is also more strategic than a lot of long prompts.
Have you seen the same, Merym, in enterprises?
No, I actually completely disagree with you in almost every way. Sorry. No, I think when it's much easier to update a prompt than it is to refine-tune a model. And prompting is, broadly I think of fine-tuning as being useful for like one of three tasks. And I think it's being squeezed from all sides. So like one way that we see it being useful is if you're trying to get your output to look in a certain way. So for example, a structured format or a JSON format or a regex format. Fine-tuning is very effective with that, but it's a bit of a pain if you want to, for example, like change the structured form that you want it to come out in, or maybe you want a new model or whatever. What is increasingly, I find much better, is using structured controllers instead. So you can, if you're self-hosting the model, can control the model such that it's only able to respond in a way that, agrees with that structured form. So from a structured point of view, I don't think it's very useful anymore. From the knowledge point of view, I think it's not auditable enough, fine-tuning, and you actually get better results, we find, with RAG, and then you also get like an audit source. And then, what was the third one? And then the third one was, I guess, like instruction following / like tone of voice. And fine-tuning is very good if you're working with a really, really dumb model, like those very small ones. But what we're increasingly seeing is that small models are becoming better and better at following instructions, and therefore need less and less fine-tuning, from our experience anyway. So the place that I think fine-tuning will continue to live is when we're dealing with situations where there's maybe very, very domain-specific like knowledge. So for example, if we're dealing with like the medical field or materials or that kind of thing. But for most enterprise use cases, I haven't actually seen a use case for it in the past 6 months. Sorry. We can exchange notes afterwards.
Dan, you looked very thoughtful during that exchange. Pick a side.
Yeah, who do you pick?
Well, I'm going to be boring and kind of go in the middle.
Oh.
Well, I guess my point is kind of just to say that I think, like, particularly with agent workflows, what we're going to start seeing is, you can imagine there's this like massively vast, non-differentiable search space. I'm kind of taking a step away from enterprise and just kind of high level, I suppose, at the moment. But like, obviously, you have all kinds of different techniques you can use to get things that are much cheaper and much better than one-shot models. Like Frugal GPT was a really good paper from last year, ages ago now. It's ancient in LLM space, but recommend reading that. And even that was a subset of the things that's possible, but that just talks about combining reprompting, so kind of augmenting the prompt, either using an LLM or otherwise, also having some fine-tuning on the nodes as well, doing, what else did they do? Oh, some routing as well, kind of dynamic routing, and kind of mixing all these together and having a non-differentiable optimization problem that is like task-specific, that then kind of makes all these decisions and optimizes it. So I feel as though there's some situations where fine-tuning is appropriate, there's some situations where reprompting is appropriate. What's probably not appropriate, particularly in the context of agentic workflows, is lots of manual playing around and tweaking things. It's kind of, again, like another place. Of course, unfortunately, we can't do gradient descent and backpropagation through prompts, but we can do reinforcement learning, and we can do auto-tuning, and packages like DSPY and so on are really interesting early examples of the kind of stuff you can do there. So that also, sorry, this is a long monologue, and it's not really answering the question you asked. but the other thing that I think is interesting is I'm not totally sure that like enterprises will continue to like be playing with LLMs directly. I don't know, but it wouldn't totally surprise me if like they spend so long trying to kind of work it all out that like there's so many verticalized Devin-style agent workflows that are much more verticalized that they can just use as a service. And this kind of period of training their own models and fine-tuning their own models and deploying them is kind of just a phase that kind of went by. And like in a year's time, everyone's just interacting with an agent like you would with someone from Upwork. And actually that's the way that enterprises engage with AI. So
I guess, Merym, you mentioned enterprises have a lot of proprietary systems that you have to integrate with, and you've seen RAG be more effective. When it comes to agents, are you seeing enterprises typically use actions that call the REST endpoint that get data, or are you seeing them typically vectorize their assets into a database and giving the agent access to that directly?
The most common workflow by far that we see in enterprise, actually it's probably all of the workflows, is some kind of RAG architecture. That's not, I don't know if you would define that as agentic, because you're getting like an embedding model to do a search for you. We haven't seen anything mature come from enterprises and agents. Have you guys?
No.
Not in production.
Oh, you have?
Limited.
Yeah.
Well, only startups. The startups doing really cool stuff.
Yeah, that's true.
And some of those are like verticalized as well. Like there's some like gaming companies that have like some crazy agent game like with the characters of the story or whatever. Like
Makes sense. And as we get to production, I guess observability on these agent workflows becomes more crucial. Dan, I guess you're a gateway to the models. Are you seeing do you facilitate sort of access to chain of thought? Is chain of thought observability a thing you're seeing a focus on?
Yeah, so I mean, it's actually one of the things we've been thinking a lot about, which is is dynamic routing enough? It's certainly a toehold for us to get in, and we have been able to take agentic workflows and basically optimize each of the nodes, each of the LLMs by doing prompting. By doing routing. What becomes very important is then to have it all optimized for the end task. Again, I'm going off on a bit of a tangent here, but I think the more things that are tailored to the end-to-end task, the better. So what we've been doing with our general router, so when you just query it as the public endpoint, we use this router that's been trained with GPT-4 as an oracle, which is pretty good at all tasks in a general way. What's much better is then when you train the router on your own data, driven not by any oracle LLM, but actually by whatever your success metric is, and then you can actually tune these nodes in your workflow. And what we've realized is obviously all of the enterprises need this to be deployed in their cloud. So we haven't quite got that yet. So this is based on a lot of conversations. But building integrations obviously with Azure and with GCP and AWS. So it's one click away to have all the models in that cloud. Because of course, enterprises don't want to start spewing their requests across 20 different providers. But they do want to be able to benchmark across the models very quickly. So the single sign-on is definitely very useful. There's some customers we're working with now, even before we got the router working, that just want to just they're building a RAG application. They're getting sick and tired of creating different keys to use all these different accounts and know how to query them. And just the ability to benchmark on every single model and provider very quickly is actually proving to be very useful. But we don't have observability stuff yet, but it's an obvious thing to build in to have those telemetry nodes as well. That is on our roadmap, Yeah, that's my answer.
Merym, you were nodding along. Do you agree? And I guess in terms of what you're doing with enterprises, do you see a focus on chain of thought observability?
Observability, yes. Chain of thought observability, not exactly. The most important, so we expose essentially everything that goes on in the model. So they have full transparency. By far the most important thing that we find that our enterprises care about is actually in the search part, so not in the generative part. A lot of the audit step, controversially, a lot of the value that you get from GenAI is not actually in the generative capabilities of the language model. For most enterprise use cases, the value actually comes from the search, being able to search semantically over all of these documents. And since that's where the value comes from, that's really where they want to be auditing as well. So they want to know which parts of documents have contributed to which answers, probably more than any particular generative capabilities. The generative capabilities are just to tell my boss I did GenAI, but don't actually provide that much value.
That might be the tagline for the next event.
Look, boss, I did GenAI.
I guess what is the thing you're most excited for to change in the GenAI space in the next 12 months? Let's make it 6 months. It moves too quickly.
6 months.
Danilo.
Oh, wow.
A prediction or something you'd be excited for?
I'm not very good in predicting the future, but one thing that I've seen is the size of the context growing, and I think that can open up new scenarios. There was this story when they train these new models that have a very large context, like 200,000 tokens or more. They do a needle in the haystack test to check that actually if I send you 150,000 words, you can understand all that content. And when they train Claude 3 and they run this test, they hit a small sentence about pizza topping inside a very long corpus. And they ran the test, and Claude 3 replied, yes, this is the sentence about the pizza topping. Actually, it's a very strange sentence. Maybe that's been put there to test me.
Yeah.
So I think that's probably just, again, it's a humanization that is wrong, because it's probably some information that's built from other sources about testing models, but it gives the idea of how capable are with a very large input.
And Tab?
Yeah, well, actually, I feel like agents wouldn't be that interesting if it wasn't for the fact that a lot of these LLMs are black box. I think, in the brain, the way that we reason and iterate on things isn't in English language. There was like an interesting paper on this recently that like, obviously like we kind of reason maybe more in vector embedding space or something more computationally efficient than like full English sentences. So an ideal system, if everything was happening in the open source, would actually be for the LLM itself to kind of train itself through more reinforcement learning, something like this. I think right now what we have in the LLM space is something that's like, I mean, this is something Andrej Karpathy said in a talk recently as well, but like it's something kind of like approximating what we had on the very first version of AlphaGo, where basically it's trained on very simple imitation learning, which is incredibly naive way of training things. When you then get kind of self-supervised reinforcement learning, you can then get, push things way, way further. So maybe something that kind of the chain of thought reasoning of GPT-4 is able to, GPT-5, let's say, is able to train itself further, because often these models are much better discriminators than generators. That's the case with people as well. You can kind of say what is a good poem or a bad poem, but it doesn't mean you can write great poetry. But you can kind of use that assessment as a reward signal to make yourself become a better poet, let's say. And like, so GPT-4, GPT-5 might be able to kind of use its own chain of thought reasoning to train itself through reinforcement learning or something like this. So I think that's kind of where things are going to go. And I think also a mixture of depths that came out from DeepMind last week is super interesting. I think basically my point is that this kind of like agents as black box LLMs is very archaic. It's kind of back to kind of hand engineering things, and it's non-differentiable, and it's kind of systems engineering, and it's kind of all going away from the end-to-end deep learning of like massive black box optimizations. And if only things were open source. There's also really interesting work showing you can mix the layers of different models. You can kind of take different layers and stack them together. So actually, when you think about how this approximates general intelligence of the brain, what we should really be having is like open models which can be mixed and end-to-end trained with optimization algorithms that are much less restrictive than having these like incredibly restrictive bandwidth data processing of English language between the LLMs. So I guess my hope is that more stuff happens in the open source space for the benefit of the scientific research and also for the benefit of kind of openness and everything. And I think if it does, we might be able to get kind of systems level optimization, including things like chain of thought reasoning, Monte Carlo rollout, reinforcement learning in these. It's going to really drive things forward more than you can do with this black box agent kind of perspective. But that depends on the big, massive data sets, the 1,000 clusters of GPUs being done in the open source, which I see no hints of. But I think on the road to long answer. On the road to AGI, I think agents as we know them will be a stepping stone towards something that ends up being much more end-to-end and much more in kind of implicit vector spaces when we talk about the communication between the nodes and stuff like this. Yeah, that's kind of my thoughts.
You got AGI in there in the end.
I did.
I guess we still have a few minutes. So do we have any questions from the audience? There's some hands going up. I think you were second on the hands up.
So what's your take on maybe unified model in the future? Do you think there's going to be any potential in the development and as well as deployment into enterprises?
By unified model, do you mean unified in terms of his company or unified in terms of like one model to rule them all?
Yes. Yes, you do. Yes, you do.
No,
like an AGI level model.
Like vision and
multimodal.
and yeah.
I think multimodal will become really quite big. I don't know if it will necessarily be that one model to rule them all in enterprise, mainly because the vast majority of unstructured data in enterprise is text. So I don't know if you get emergent properties by deploying models that also have vision capabilities if you don't actually end up using the vision capabilities. My intuition is that language models will be by far the most popular in enterprise.
I personally think that probably multimodal training will actually improve the quality of the language models as well. I kind of generally think that, again, similar to the brain, the whole reason I got an AI actually was because I was reading loads of neuroscience books, and I kind of think the way we should approach AI is kind of trying to mimic what evolution did for our brain and everything, because it's the only thing we know that's worked. And time has kind of proven that to be right in a way that like a lot of compute and a lot of data gives emergent intelligence, kind of same with evolution. Anyway, that's again zooming out a bit. But I think, yeah, I can't imagine that you can get like something that's only trained on text that really has a deep intuitive understanding of the 3D world, and that includes reasoning with language questions about the 3D world. So I think it's going to be necessary for very capable general intelligence systems to be a singular model that is trained on multiple modes of data to kind of really appreciate the richness of reality. And I think that's going to be the best foundation model to do any kind of fine-tuning, in the same way that the human brain is the best kind of foundation model, and then each individual person in the world is kind of fine-tuned for their job or their profession and their personality and their life or whatever. And we start with an incredibly rich data stream of vision, hearing, touch, language, and all of that kind of builds our internal model of the world. And I think foundation models that do that will be the best and can be fine-tuned for all the tasks as well. So I kind of think it's essential for, on the path to AGI, to have multimodality, probably. But yeah, let's see.
I think there's a question from over here at the start.
It's about like data sets, right? If agents are, the future, how do you build a data set for agents? And isn't it like very expensive to do in terms of creating like lots of different optimal plans for different inputs? And then how do you rate whether a plan is better than another plan if they're like too complicated for you to understand?
Well, I can kind of step in quickly, which is I think the best way to optimize an agent workflow would need to be with some kind of ground truth data set for what you want the agent to do, and like the expected input and the expected output of the entire system, and then kind of trying to end-to-end train the entire thing. But I guess, as you're saying, like you do need to have some kind of systems level design. So I guess like if you can't understand which plan is better, I guess it becomes a very difficult debugging problem where you're not sure where it's gone wrong and everything. One other point you just said was about the cost and being very expensive. I generally think that what a lot of companies should be doing now, and some are doing, is kind of just trying to get it working, because still it's probably cheaper than the manual process that's there, even if it is quite expensive to run the agent, and the costs are going to exponentially drop in the next 12, 18, 24 months. So I guess like I wouldn't worry about cost too much. If you're doing small scale things, if you're an enterprise and this is now being deployed and it's costing you like millions of dollars, then yeah, maybe. But like,
so is that like, are you more leaning towards the idea of agents that are kind of fine-tuned for like a smaller set of possible actions than something that's like, imagine you have like a data set the size of a pile or something, but it's like for plans and actions? How would
yeah, I guess the way that I imagine this, maybe I'm thinking about this differently, and obviously Florence can chime in, but I think when you have agent workflows, the best way to optimize them is kind of end-to-end on the task, and then you just need to define the prompts in the middle that kind of that define the plan and do this. But the data set, you don't need to have a data set for the planning. I guess you need a data set for the kind of task and an ideal what it should look like when it's completed, and then you can kind of test out the agent on that, and you need to kind of play around with the plan, like break this up into 4 steps, break this up into 5 steps, execute this step, use this tool, and kind of you need to do system engineering there. That doesn't require a data set to train, like decide what those prompts should be, but you might need a data set to validate that the system is working on some certain data sets.
All right, go ahead.
Going back to the question of prompt engineering versus fine-tuning, I'm always on the quest to sort of automate everything at work that I can do. One of the main things is automating away writing. The problem is though, is that when you're trying to get a specific output, you want it to be in the right style and tone of voice. Do you think fine-tuning is still the correct way of doing that? Or is that sort of...
This is funny. This is actually the one time that I do think fine-tuning is better. I was actually talking about this the other day with my co-founder, that like I think probably one of the biggest reasons to not use GPT-4 is because it just sounds so lame. Like it just sounds like a massive loser. If you like just change models and use like something like a Mistral or a Mixtral, it gets a little bit spicier. So like if you also just play around with the model you're using, that can also help.
Should use Grok.
Yeah, I mean, Grok is like on the completely other end. But yeah, if you like change the model you're using, if you like still can't find any models that work, then yeah, like fine tuning is a legitimately like good option for tone of voice.
Is that better than just doing like few shot type things with a prompt and saying like, particularly with the context windows getting bigger,
if it
just go like, here are all my previous emails, now write me an email, and it will just do it in your style anyway.
If it works, it works. And like I've also found, like I always tell my AI to like, don't say things like in this rapidly evolving landscape kind of thing, or like saying really lame things. And if you just say like, don't say things like this, say things like this, it helps. I also got a tip that if you want to sound like kind of in your 20s, if you append I am a YC founder to your prompt, it also sounds less lame. So there's different things you can try.
Okay.
I'm not a YC founder, but
I think that's us out of time. Oh, there's
Oh.
one last hand up. We can do the last one.
Curious, what do you think? How much demand and is there for small versus large models? And what do you think the price will be for small versus large models? Like, will people will need to pay, 10x for something that was IQ 130 as opposed to IQ 100? And what would the demand be?
I mean, it really depends on what your task is. Like, I wouldn't hire a PhD person to do the job that a 10-year-old could do. And I think it's like a similar thing with your models. So like, you want something that's good enough to do the task reliably, but you don't need overkill. Like, you don't need the king of the king to do every single task. And that's why Dan exists.
Exactly. Shameless plug. That's why we have a router. So yeah, I mean, I agree with that. Although actually, again, like sci-fi futurism mode a second, again, I kind of think there's going to be a dissolving between the two anyway, because again, like taking the analogy of the brain, we're only ever using a tiny percentage of the brain at any point in time. And this is kind of related to mixture of depths, the DeepMind paper from last week. So I think like, AGI style systems will end up being a large model that's using a very small percentage of its weights. Obviously, that's what mixture of experts do. They use like 17% of the weights at any point in time. Mixture of depths goes further than that still. So I think the best systems will be ones that probably have been trained on a huge amount of data, are like very general capable machines like our brains are, but are incredibly data efficient, incredibly power efficient, and use a very small percentage of the resources at any point in time when doing a query. Obviously we do like, again, these kind of hacky systems things again that will come back into AI that never used to be there. It was all like end-to-end systems, and now because it's black box, we're doing all kinds of like non-differentiable hacks to kind of get it working. But I think that the ideal network will actually have kind of almost caching implicitly, because there was just going to be like a short feedback loop that gives you the answer. And so I think the difference between big models and small models will dissolve over time, and like the efficiency will be there in a big model, but it won't be like doing 1 billion matrix multiplications to get the answer, which it is today, which is incredibly inefficient. So I think there's going to be like a coming together of the two, whether that's behind the API of GPT-5, which it probably will be, or ideally some of this happening in the open source as well. I think that's kind of the mental model of how these things should look. But until that point, you can dynamically route between them using our router.
Amazing. I think we're reaching the end of our context windows. So, Dan, where can people find out more about Unify?
Unify.ai. So just go there, and then you can join our Discord if you want. So we've got an active Discord community. So if you go to unify.ai and click on community and click on Discord, I'm online all the time, so feel free to ask me any questions.
And Merym, where can people find out about Titan ML?
I don't know where that QR code goes, so you could try that. Otherwise, titanml.co. I think, does that go to my LinkedIn?
Yeah.
That's a good place.
And Danilo, I think people know where to find AWS, but
Yes.
in terms of the books that you write and the content you write, where is the best place for people to find it?
Oh yeah, I spend most of my time with the AWS news blog, so try to describe the new launches that we make. So hopefully in the next few weeks something interesting in this space will appear there.
Amazing, thanks so much. So thanks again to our panelists.
Thank you.